My name is Lori Paris, and welcome to She Life. My mother, Catherine Smith Gatormson, whose mother is Catherine Victoria Smith, whose mother is Nancy Smith, whose mother is Marion Mackenzie, named me Lori Jean. I knew only two of these four women, but I carry their blood in my veins and their memories in my bones. May I speak our collective truth in a way that makes good change in a world that needs great change. The time has come for you and I to take our rightful sacred place in a culture that denies it. This is my story and journey to uncover the truth that supports my right to do just that, no matter the cost. I hope you decide you deserve that sacred place too. Episode 8, Helena Roerich and a Holy Stone, Part 2. On November 1st, 1998, the White Mountain Education Association published a book titled At the Threshold of a New World, Dreams, Visions, and Letters of Helena Roerich. The book shares dreams and visions Helena had while dedicating her life to Master Moria and her family. Helena would have many prophetic dreams, and this dream in 1911 supported her belief that the Messiah would soon return, but also carried a warning of her family's financial demise. Helena recalls her dream and writes in her journal, Nicholas and I are riding in a tarantass in the evening twilight across a broad valley on a road lined with trees. Suddenly, a strong hurricane begins and the sky turns a velvet black. The trees, whistling in the wind, bend down to the earth. Our tarantass turns upside down. We fall into the ditch but remain unharmed. With a deafening explosion of thunder, the dark vault of heaven opens, and from a crucible of fire, like a lightning bolt, a giant, fiery, scaly fish falls head first upon the earth. Its forked tail curls up, forming a caryatid propped against the dark sky. A gigantic pillar of fire thus connects heaven and earth. Helena learns that the fish is a symbol of the Messiah, and when the Messiah appears, the earthly and heavenly realms shake upon its descent to land on earth. I too would learn about a fish after my dream of the woman who smashed repeatedly on a steel anvil as she fell from heaven to tell me that earth was an experiment gone wrong. This fish I learned about was also believed to be the savior of humanity. On Sunday, March 24th, 1929, a ceremony to lay the cornerstone in the foundation of the new master building that was built to house the Roark Museum at 310 Riverside Drive in New York City was held. Nicholas and Helena Roerich would have placed inside this cornerstone a 13th century Rothenburg casket that contained a fragment of their stone from the planet Sirius. The event would see 500 guests in attendance and also receive many telegrams of congratulations, including messages from the President of Mexico, Senator Marconi of Italy, and the theoretical physicist Albert Einstein. A speech delivered by James Sullivan that day, the Assistant Commissioner of Education of New York, shared in a New York Times article, carried a clear message to his fellow citizens of American intolerance and bigotry. He said, "A via crucis is America's biggest need today. We hypothesize our own moral code and are blissfully ignorant of the fact that other peoples are just as proud of theirs. We condemn Buddha and Confucius without knowing who they were or what they thought. We set up our missionary houses in other lands to entice little children under the guise of athletics and Boy Scout movements so we may pour our particular brand of culture into them. And we run out of town those of other nations who would like a reciprocal right in this country. Not satisfied with prohibiting ourselves from doing things, we wish to carry our doctrines so as to force the whole world to do as we are doing. The article reports that Sullivan declared that protective tariffs had ruined industries in other nations, causing poverty and misery there, so that despite American charity, it was no wonder Americans found themselves objects of growing antipathy abroad. Our only hope, he said, is that more men like Nicholas Roark will come here to teach us sweet reasonableness and convert us to the point of view of respect for the customs, manners, art, and literature of all the peoples of the world. Sullivan's speech was delivered in the shell of what was to be a hall of nations, having been decked with the flags of all countries, a clear indicator of the work that would follow by the Roerichs, including the Roark Pact that was written by Helena and Nicholas with the help of international legal experts. According to the website of the current Nicholas Roerich Museum in New York, 3 international conferences were held in Belgium, Uruguay, and in Washington, D.C. The Pact itself declared the necessity for protection of the cultural product and activity of the world, both during war and peace, and prescribed the method by which all sites of cultural value would be declared neutral and protected, just as the Red Cross does with hospitals. Indeed, the Roark Pact was often called the Red Cross of culture. In reference to the circle with the 3 dots on the peace banner of the Pact, Roark described the circle as representing the totality of culture, with the 3 dots being art, science, and religion, 3 of the most embracing of human cultural activities. He also described the circle as representing the eternity of time, encompassing the past, present, and future. The sacred origins of the symbol as an illustration of the Trinities fundamental to all religions remains central to the meaning of the Pact and the banner today. The Roark Pact was first agreed to by 21 nations of the Americas and signed as a treaty in the White House in the presence of President Franklin D. Roosevelt on April 15, 1935. Many of the ideals of the Roarks in their international treaty, including its banner of peace, would be incorporated into UNESCO, the United Nations educational, scientific, and cultural arm. As recently as June 12, 2013, in the opening remarks of an exhibition of Nicholas Roerich's work given by Kasim Jomart Tokayev, the United Nations Undersecretary General and the Director General of the United Nations Office at Geneva at the time, agreed, saying, "As we see through this exhibition, Nicholas Roerich was a pioneer in the promotion of peace and of culture. He was a champion for the protection of cultural heritage, and the Roark Pact, the international treaty signed in 1935 by 21 countries which enshrined his ideals, paved the way for further international agreements to preserve cultural monuments at times of war and in peace." The ideas and thoughts of Nicholas Roerich were ahead of their time. They were directed to the future in our era, and they will be in huge demand by the generations to come. On Thursday, October 17, 1929, approximately 7 months after the laying of the cornerstone in the Master Building, the Roark Museum would have its grand opening and exhibit 1,000 paintings, of which 500 were being shown for the first time in its entirety. The museum also included a display of Tibetan art treasures in a room called the Hall of the East, with artifacts that Nicholas and Helena had acquired during their travels. A beautiful Tibetan shrine was erected in the hall for the event, where 100 candles were lit and shone brightly for their guests. Louis Horch, the man who would eventually betray the Roarks, would present Nicholas with a medal that day, acknowledging his contribution to art, culture, and world peace. Also that day, Nicholas Roerich, a Russian, would be referred to as a leader of mankind. This exalted status would be acknowledged by Franklin D. Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, who was often spotted in the Master Building studying landscapes of Tibet in the galleries. This influential politician was also an avid disciple of the Roerichs. That evening, while everyone celebrated this exceptional achievement, no one could have imagined that 12 days later, on Tuesday, October 29th, the day known as Black Tuesday, that the New York stock market would crash. The decade in France, known as the Crazy Years, was known in North America as the Roaring Twenties, a time that redefined social norms in many areas of life, including art and culture. The 20s are known for many things: jazz, prohibition, women obtaining the right to vote, and fashion designer Coco Chanel, who greatly influenced the flappers, women who cut their hair, wore short skirts, and enjoyed a good party. It was also a time of substantial economic prosperity after World War I and saw immense growth in commercial and residential construction. Electricity allowed for the mass production of goods, and the United States, per capita, became the wealthiest country in the world. In the Roaring Twenties, citizens began enjoying lifestyles that included electrical appliances, telephones, radio, film, and the development of media that was funded by these new industries to drive consumer demand. Consumerism had found its footing by using celebrities, including movie stars and sports heroes, a strategy that continues today. But not all people bought into the new lifestyle of the constant consumption of goods. Many young people who had witnessed the atrocities of World War I were now disillusioned with society and were speaking out. Many were the writers of the time, including Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote about the materialism that was overtaking American culture and their dismay at these trends. They were part of a group of young people called the Lost Generation. But where the 20s had their most impressive display of success was on the New York Stock Exchange. Share prices saw unprecedented highs, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average increasing sixfold from August 1921 to September 1929, many believing that this positive growth would continue for years to come. But it did not. And on October 29, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed as 16 million shares were traded on a single day, wiping out thousands of investors. Stock prices would continue to decline until 1932, and by 1933, 50% of all banks in the United States had failed, leaving their depositors in financial crisis. Many lost their life savings, and the rich lifestyle they had been living the year before began to disintegrate, with many fearing for their jobs and their ability to pay the bills and put food on the table. In 1934, 5 years after the crash, Helena and her husband Nicholas would be thrown into their own financial crisis when Louis Horch, a disciple of the Roarks and a major investor in the Roark Museum and the Master Building, betrayed them by reincorporating all the business holdings and removing their names from these documents without their knowledge, eventually losing all their assets. It would take close to 25 years for the United States to recover from the stock market crash. The Roarks would never recover. In part 1, I shared that almost 100 years ago, in October 1923, 6 years before the Roarks were to move into their new museum and offices in the Master Building on the Upper West Side of New York, the Roarks received a box that contained a 13th century Rothenberg casket, and inside that casket was a stone that was covered by a piece of leather decorated with magical symbols. They would call the stone Chintamani, with Helena describing it as a gift from the constellation Orion to the planet Earth. Nicholas Roark would also name the stone Lapis Exilis, the same name given to the Grail stone in Wolfram von Eschenbach's poem and subsequent book Parzival. I also shared that Ian Heron, a researcher in the field of the Roarks and their Chintamani stone, said that in the center of the cloth covering the casket was the monogram of Christ, the letters IHS, the most common Christogram or combination of three letters of the name Jesus, and interpreted to mean Jesus, Savior of men or humankind, and some believe it to mean in his service. This Christogram has been used as a symbol of the Jesuits, the same Jesuits Helena believed were looking to take possession of their Chintamani stone and worried that they may cause her physical harm in the process. In research for my upcoming book, Mother Crucified, I happened upon a documentary called Lapis Exilis, a Latin phrase that means exiled or wandering stone, the same name given to Wolfram von Eschenbach's Grail stone. The documentary was produced by Freemason Gavin Wentz and Louis Buff Perry, a poet, scholar, code cracker, and international intelligence advisor whose research the documentary is based on. Perry states that Nicholas Roark knew Jean Cocteau and that they traveled together through Paris in 1918 and 1919 on collective art projects with Igor Stravinsky, such as the opera The Rites of Spring. And according to Perry, they actually became quite close. Igor Stravinsky's father was an established opera singer, and Nicholas Roerich a set and costume designer in this genre. Perry also discovered information that led him to believe that perhaps the Chintamani stone that the Roerichs had received in Paris in 1923 may have been sent to them by Jean Cocteau. Perry had learned in his research that Cocteau had been listed as a Grand Master of the Priory of Sion, an organization that appeared between 1964 and 1967, with its foundational documents being registered and deposited in the National Library of France in Paris, but would later discover, as all of us, that this organization was deemed a hoax. To date, no one knows for certain who sent the stone to the Roerichs, but in 1918 and 1919, the same years Cocteau was traveling with Nicholas Roerich, Emma Calvé, one of the most famous opera stars of her time and a key player in the mystery of Rennes-le-Château, was still performing and was known worldwide. Perry writes about the actual Priory of Zion in a paper he submitted to the Epigraphic Society Occasional Papers, Volume 27, titled Rachel Resurrexit, a Latin phrase meaning Rachel raised again, and says that in 1617, the actual non-fictionized Priory of Zion, after leaving Jerusalem, meaning Sion, was absorbed into this Jesuit order, including the priory archives and artifacts, and also claims that there is an inner order of the Jesuits, the mysterious hierarchy which directs the Jesuits as a whole, are reputedly privy to some puissant secret, puissant meaning having great power, force, or influence. He also says that Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Society of Jesus or Jesuits, is depicted with the monogram IHS, an allusion to his claim that he has miraculous knowledge of the Trinity vouchsafed to him, and that the covert mission of the Jesuits' inner order had more to do with the secret of the Trinity, and in particular, the idea that the Holy Spirit that Jesus predicted in the Gospel of John was a person and not a third facet of God, a Messiah that will one day return to earth. The dream of Helena Roerich I shared at the beginning of this podcast was to continue the next evening as Helena slept. She was again riding with her husband Nicholas in the Tarantus, a four-wheel horse-drawn carriage used in Russia, and says, "My husband and I are riding in the same Tarantus across a dismal countryside, which is utterly devoid of any sign of either vegetation or dwellings. Everything around us is scorched. The sky and the ground are of the same gray or grayish yellow color. For a long time we ride across this horrible wasteland, seeing neither birds nor animals. At last we see a distant hill. Rejoicing, we approached the hill, intending to climb to its top in the hope of seeing something on the horizon. But to our horror, after drawing close to the hill, we see that it is not a hill at all, but a huge, coiled, sleeping serpent of the same color as the land around it. It crosses my mind that this reptile has devoured everything and then has fallen asleep. According to the threat simulation theory, a theory stating that the biological function of dreaming is to simulate threatening events, of which 66% contain at least one threat and predominantly involve danger to the dreamer, and that the person having the dream does not succeed in avoiding the threat presented. This was definitely the case for Helena and Nicholas, as their chief disciple, Louis Horch, who managed the business holdings of the corporation since its inception in 1923, would reincorporate the business, hoping to quell the fears of investors after the stock market crash of 1929. The Roarks would be unaware that in the reincorporation, they would lose their assets and power within it. According to John Buchanan, in his book, Nicholas Roark, The Artist Who Would Be King, Buchanan writes, an ominous sign of things to come involved Louis Horch's refinancing of the Master Institute in December of 1934. At the time, everyone in the circle welcomed this measure, which fended off the Institute's most dissatisfied investors. Secretly, though, Horch carried out a simultaneous reincorporation of the Institute and the businesses connected to it. By February 1935, control would rest wholly in his hands. Names that remained with voting rights within the new corporation were Horch's wife Nettie and Esther Lichtman, the woman who would replace Helena as their spiritual leader, and others chosen by Horch that he knew would support his actions. George and Svetoslav Roark, Sina Fostek, one of the Roark's most devoted and loyal disciples, and Francis Grant, a major contributor to the success of the business, were also removed from having any control. Grant had complained many times to the Roarks concerning the less than stellar work ethic of the Horches and Esther Lichtman, and is quoted as saying in Buchanan's book, if the trio, Louis, Nettie, and Esther, had shown before 1/10 of industry for our constructive labor, which they are now showing for destruction, great progress could have been made. Louis Horch, keeping the secret reincorporation to himself, would continue a ruse of supporting the Roarks and their partnership by hand-delivering approximately 9 letters to Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States at the time, on behalf of Helena in March of 1935, just 1 month after the secret betrayal. Although there is no proof that the President responded to these letters, Helena's replies suggest he may have, as there are indicators of a conversation in the ongoing correspondence. Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, would also exchange letters with the Roarks, and these letters, known as the Guru letters, would become a thorn in his side after being named as Roosevelt's running mate for vice president in the U.S. presidential election of 1940. The betrayal would lead to the Roarks being investigated and audited by the IRS with the help of Henry Wallace, and a lawsuit against the Roarks seeking $200,000 by Louis Horch in an effort to seize the museum, paintings, and ancient artifacts housed within it. Horch would succeed in his lawsuit and close the Roark Museum in 1938 and rename it the Riverside Museum. A museum once dedicated to a multicultural display of art was now solely dedicated to contemporary American painting and sculpture. The Roarks at that time would also receive notice from the IRS indicating that they owed the U.S. government approximately $50,000 in back taxes. During the investigation of the Roarks by the IRS and the lawsuits for control of the master building, adversaries of the Roarks would publicly accuse them of being charlatans and suggest Nicholas was a spy. Buchanan clears this defamation by writing in his book, in his own time, Roark was suspected of political scheming, and many have tried for decades to discern the nature and extent of his clandestine activities. Gaps in the record remain, but the materials we have indicate that Roark was no spy in the conventional sense of being employed by a particular intelligence bureau. For the last 7 years of Helena Roerich's life, from 1948 to 1955, she lived in Crookedy House, a mansion designed as an English cottage that faced Kanchenjunga Mountain in the Himalayas, the third tallest mountain in the world. Helena lived in this house with her son George in quiet solitude, writing, painting, and meditating, her husband Nicholas having died in 1947. Helena, who had been born into a noble Russian family, would never set foot in her homeland again. The Roarks were not welcome there, nor would they be welcome in the United States after the powerful people who once supported their efforts as avid disciples of their spiritual message turned against them to save their wealth and political aspirations after the stock market crash of 1929. It was India who found the compassion for this couple and offered them a safe haven to live out their senior years in peace. The Roarks were not spies. They were dreamers and doers, with Nicholas willing to dedicate his life to his wife and she to him and their master Moria, and the shared belief that they were preparing for the return of the last Messiah. McCannon concludes in the research for his book, Nicholas Roark, The Artist Who Would Be King, that protracted examination led him to conclude that the Roarks believed in what they prophesied. Readers will cherish or deride those prophecies as they will, but I do not consider them fraudulent in the sense of having been manufactured solely to deceive, and agrees with German historian Marcus Osterreiter's assertion that the Roarks understood themselves and their mission as part of some larger spiritual plan and did not consciously act as imposters. Helena was Nicholas's goddess, the goddess that Robert Graves encouraged all men to pay full-time homage to, all three believing in a mother of the world that would eventually come to save humanity. It's a shame Helena did not have anyone to interpret her prophetic dream of 1911 and warn her of the betrayal that was in her and Nicholas's future that would end the mission she and he wholeheartedly believed they were destined to complete. Although the serpent was asleep in her dream, she knew it had a voracious appetite. What she didn't know was what it had eaten. Unfortunately, it had devoured their assets and their dream of a new country with a new temple that was to be built by human hands and human feet. But in the end, their human bodies had no financial support to do so.